Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on philosophy, logic, medieval Europe, and William of Ockham. And Occam's razor is the idea for which he is still famous. He is one of the figures I've spoken of in connection with Lewis Carroll because he was one of the people at early Oxford who was teaching Plato and Aristotelian logic and writing commentaries on that. So William of Ockham was born sometime around 1285, somewhere near the village of Ockham. Now, of course, his last name is pretty much where he's from, like with a lot of folks all around the world. Southwest of London, a village, ordained a Franciscan priest at 14. This is, again, a lot of these people went to college until they were 16 and learned what there was to know at the time, whether or not they were that talented when they were that young. Studied theology at Oxford at 15 and lectured and wrote commentaries as Aquinas did a few years before him. He was brought to Avignon for 4 years on trial for possible heresy, beat the rap, then fled to Pisa, where they have an interesting slant on architecture, with several Franciscans who thought Pope John the 22nd was heretical for rejecting Francis's idea of absolute poverty for the followers of Jesus. The Franciscans, as I like to mention, the Franciscans are definitely into poverty. They were also competing with other Catholic groups, and they had temporarily chased the Jesuits nearby here out of a large peninsula, which is a whole lot of real estate worth it now, or the bunch, called San Francisco. And when they chased out the Jesuits, they called it after themselves, St. Francis, the Franciscans. But again, we're speaking of rogue groups of Franciscans too widely here roving in the world, and that was later. Probably in the 1400s, about 1500s, early 1500s, most likely. So Occam continued to work and died in Munich under the protection of the German emperor and Franciscan order. Takes me back to the old country. But he never reconciled with the church. I like Eriugena. He lived around 900, and he also was persecuted by the church, but kept alive by the King of France at the time, so as long as you got into somebody's good graces, either politics or religion couldn't touch you. Occam wrote that if somebody says they want to talk about things themselves, not words, signs, or concepts, he says the only way we can talk about things themselves is using audible, visible, and mental words. Occam's philosophy is often called nominalism. I do not believe he uses that word, based on the idea that words are names and mental acts and nothing more, without universal reality, similar in ways to Avicenna and unlike Averroes and Aquinas. Now, if you'll remember, Avicenna argued that our concept of a horse and unicorn are both real mental concepts, but one applies to actual horses and the other doesn't. While Occam says in his Summa Logicae and commentaries on Aristotle that he is simply explaining Aristotle, he is actually doing something different than Aristotle. Avicenna, Averroes, or Aquinas, the logic of Occam alone, and quite modern in ways to many. Occam is, oddly enough, a bit like Lewis Carroll and a bit like Wittgenstein, and I am going to be doing more about the connections between Lewis Carroll and Wittgenstein because that has been inspiring me plenty the entire time, and nominalism is very similar to Wittgenstein saying that naming something, and I was just discussing this with a group, naming something is like slapping a label on something. It's good to say that. Why is it good to say that? Because naming things can seem universal and metaphysical, but in fact they are human practices. Occam inspired, you can find human beings in Christianity, Islam, and around the world, and many Muslims and Christians at this time doing philosophy, saying that because God and objectivity, we can name things objectively what they are, but you also find more skeptical, cynical schools of thought. I do believe thought, a la Hegel, branches out into more dogmatic and more skeptical forms in all cultures. A bit. Plenty. I have to say, it seems it. And in the interactions of people trust and distrust authorities, practices, institutions. So in this, Occam is giving a very cynical, skeptical position with nominalism. It is not entirely truth is subjective. That's not the position. It's not necessarily Wittgenstein's position that truth is subjective, but If it is human practices, naming porcupines is not so much that the group we know as porcupines is metaphysically or absolutely separate from all other groups. It is that we slap that label on porcupines and we don't on other things. So it actually does involve the human practices in order to name things, which means we are applying words to certain things, not others, which is a pragmatic, more, one could say, skeptically leaning, as opposed to not necessarily that things are subjective, but it definitely leans on the side that naming things is human convention. Thus, nominalism and nom is meaning name in the root of the word. So essentially, for Ockham, the written, visible word is inferior to the spoken word, which is inferior to the mental internal word, which Ockham, like Heraclitus, identifies with concepts and understandings. Vygotsky, as I like to mention, was not a Russian form of freeze tag. He was basically the Piaget of Soviet Russia in the 20s and 30s, and he said what I do believe is still possibly consider the case, even for those who don't know who Vygotsky is, that we learn to talk, and as we learn to talk, we talk externally and internally, and that is thought outside and inside of us all together, back and forth. And we learn much of how to think, not that thinking always involves talking, but that thinking involves a lot of talking, and so we learn a lot of how to think internally and externally, communicating with words. So, and that doesn't exclusively say it has to happen that way, it just does a lot, which is very Wittgensteinian. So, the printing press had yet to arrive in Europe from China by way of Islamic lands, and so, like Plato, most considered direct personal communication far more reliable for teaching others. Derrida likes to point that out, that he thinks that philosophers privilege spoken communication, direct human contact over the written language, but Derrida likes playing with how written words work differently, and that's fine, because they can. And they don't need to be better or worse, which I like that, and I admire that point of view. I find it influential and awesome. Much else about Derrida is confusing and hard to understand for many. Aquinas argued, in line with both Avicenna and Averroes by degrees, that words refer both to our concepts and physical things. But Ockham, going past Averroes, argues that words only refer to individuals, not even, secondarily, to concepts. While internal speech is a mental act of understanding, the speech does not refer to itself, but points to the world. For example, the term, which is terminus, for Ockham in the Latin, the term human points to human individuals one at a time, and the broader general term humanity refers to anything substantially and actually human. Ockham argues, much like Wittgenstein, that philosophers, theologians, and logicians get confused when they try to understand humanity in itself as something mental by itself, and not as something mental that points to actual humans, indicating an object rather than expressing a separate essence. Let me say that again. Screwed that up. Not as something mental that points to actual existing individuals, but rather as something as a separate essence. Now, this is very important because this is really an evil mid-early Wittgenstein, isn't it? Mid-early. Well, yes. So let's labor here. The humanity does not do anything altogether. So we can't say humanity eats as a whole, like an individual does at a particular time. But human individuals regularly behave as humanity does, plenty, as each do, each eating alone or hopefully in small emotional supportive groups, such that the word humanity refers to all. And we can say generally humanity eats, but this refers to the individuals eating, not the overall concept. Now, this is a very Wittgensteinian pragmatic point of view. In fact, I think this does prefigure Wittgenstein more than plenty, and the fact that Lewis Carroll was into it, and he is much like and prefiguring Wittgenstein as Wittgenstein is reading and appreciating Lewis Carroll during his later period, does at least indirectly connect Ockham to Wittgenstein, although Wittgenstein is of the Cambridge crowd, but that doesn't mean he's not of something influenced by British philosophy in general. As an imported Austrian. Exported, depends on where you are. Ockham is also known for Occam's razor, the famous idea for which he is known. Also an excellent idea, sometimes misunderstood. Often it is stated the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Often, I keep saying often. The simplest explanation is often, or generally, not always, or simply, the correct one. This also fits with the nominalist pragmatic position. It's not that things are metaphysically necessary, it's that horses often are individuals that are alike. And as with the past point, it is that my mind points at horses and deals with horses rather than me figure out what horses are in themselves. I do believe in using Wittgenstein to empty out our concepts from our head that kind of way and show that they're actually practices in the world with individuals. Sometimes imaginary individuals, but that gets risky if we only have imaginary individuals. So if our understandings are just convenient placeholders that point to things themselves, then most often it would not be mental complexification that would solve the problems, yes, hence the razor, but rather the most simple and practical mental moves that allow for reality to reveal itself and its workings, not the secret mental essential workings that only our ideas can grasp beyond our senses. Occam's razor is somewhat like and somewhat not like the movie Hellraiser, which sounds like a razor from hell in verbal words, but doesn't look like one when written, funny enough. Hellraiser, razor, and it's like, no, it's not that kind of, it's a razor as in, it's all arisen. So, this also ties into, I want to mention Poe. I have theories about Poe that I believe that in his detective stories he is hiding a crime, quite obviously, and wants us to detect it, and he says, and has Dupin, his proto-Sherlock Holmes, the major inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, say, the brilliant is always simple and stupid, which sounds like Poe extending the idea of Occam, and he has the ape wield a razor. In fact, the ape wielding the razor, I think if we pay more attention to it than we do at the end of the story often, we can see that hidden crime because that's what happened. Actually, I believe that another sailor was killed with a razor. Please see my videos on that. I have to say, I do think I would not insist on it and make such videos if I did not think it was quite clearly a case. Well, I have to say, I do think that Poe, who is somewhat familiar with British and French philosophy a bit, and by way of art a lot, that he is possibly, when he has his brilliant rational, and Poe did consider himself both a romantic poet and a rational mathematician, which is what he has his detective say, that Occam's razor may be something that Poe appreciated very much in his detective stories, and the first one in particular, and that use of the razor is quite horrid with the ape and the women, etc. But with that, he says, the simplest, stupidest explanation of someone's passion explaining the whole crime is often the simplest explanation, and the brute razor is truly what solves the first and then the second of what I believe are the crimes in there. So Poe definitely appreciated what I am increasingly appreciating of this Occam's razor idea of Occam, who lived around, around 1300. That with Europe would not have significant power over the Islamic world for another 400 years. That with all of that, if you are paying more attention with Poe to people's motives and emotions and reading their faces and their motives more and paying more attention to that than a bunch of words and a bunch of metaphysics and a bunch of complicated concepts that don't have concrete examples, you will not be a truly brilliant thinker, which I think fits very complementary-wise with Poe's use of Occam's razor. I had to add that isn't in my original notes, but because I've been thinking about this idea with Poe, I definitely think that Poe, the ape and the razor, is Poe tipping his hat to Occam quite clearly, and that definitely fits his explanation from proto-Sherlock Holmes that the simplest and stupidest explanation is typically, with human beings, what they're trying to hide from you as the greater detective. So, with all of that, much love and happiness to you and yours. Hopefully, again, you enjoy my videos. Please ask me questions nicely in the comments, please. And as always, I will see ya if I ever do see ya.